Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Provincial Office webinar, with a special welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time, and indeed those joining us from other provinces. I do hope you're all safe and well. My name's Andrew Rydell, and I'm the Provincial Deputy Grand Secretary. So, to today's session. It's a pleasure to welcome Right Worshipful Brother John Pagella, past Junior Grand Warden. John was a chartered surveyor who practiced throughout the UK, and that led him to become First Assistant, then Deputy, and finally Grand Superintendent of Works in 2014 until 2019. John was promoted to past Junior Grand Warden in 2018. Currently, he is Chair of the Hall Committee at Freemasons Hall, as well as the Masonic Halls Advisory Group. He is also a member of the Property Investment Committee. John, welcome to the province of West Lancashire. I'll stop talking and hand straight over to you.
Andrew, thank you very much, and good afternoon, brethren. I'm delighted to have been asked to join you this afternoon, but I'm going to start with two apologies. Firstly, Zoom is marvellous, but when you have a prepared script and no auto cue, it can seem a little bit remote because I'm inevitably going to be reading from my prepared script. So apologies for that, but I hope if we have time for questions, I can engage with you a little bit more directly. Secondly, apologise for my Robinson Crusoe haircut, but I guess I'm not alone in that. I will be very happy to take questions at the end if you wish and if time allows, but if we reach that point, I must stress that I'm with you this afternoon in a personal capacity and not as a spokesperson for UGLE. I thought you might find it interesting if I start by looking back to the origins not only of Freemasons Hall, but also the office of the Grand Superintendent of Works. I shall then explain how what the holder of that office does today is managed within the committee structure at Grand Lodge, before finally running briefly through some of the projects on which we are currently working, and I will finish with a few words about the Masonic Hall's Guidance Manual. The Office of Grand Superintendent of Works was created after the union of the two Grand Lodges, you'll remember the Ancients and the Moderns, and the formation of the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813. Interestingly, no allowance had been made in the original constitution of the United Grand Lodge for a Grand Superintendent of Works. But as the same constitution also omitted the Grand Director of Ceremonies and the Grand Organist, I was obviously in good company. Freemason in those early years was far smaller than it is today, but it quickly became apparent that Grand Lodge needed an advisor able to give guidance and advice in relation to land and buildings. Sir John Soane, who was later to become the first Grand Superintendent of Works, was at the time a well-known and widely connected architect, and by all accounts the then Grand Master decided that he was the person for the job. He set about making him a Freemason, and in 1814 he created a Masonic office of suitable standing to reflect his status in society. The revised constitutions of 1815 provided for not only the appointment of the Grand Superintendent of Works, but also the Grand Director of Ceremonies and a Grand Organist. Although in practice the responsibilities of the Grand Superintendent of Works today are many and varied, their description in the Book of Constitutions is interesting and remarkably concise. Rule 35 states the Grand Superintendent of Works shall advise the Board of General Purposes, when required, on any matter in connection with the building and the works. He shall furnish reports on the state of repair of the properties of the Grand Lodge when required. If you want to understand the responsibilities which you have as an active Grand Lodge officer, you can of course do one of two things. Consult the Book of Constitutions, and I have explained what that revealed, or speak to Graham Redman. When I asked Graham if Rule 35 meant that as Grand Superintendent of Works, all I had to do was submit periodic reports on necessary works we intended to carry out to keep the building in repair, his reply was to the effect, well, you may find that in practice it is rather more than that. How right he was. Masonry, in the words of the ritual, is a progressive science. Apart from the Masonic symbolism behind this statement, it is also true of the way that we all progress in our Masonic careers. First, through the three degrees in our craft lodge, then through lodge offices to the Master's chair, and for some, the Royal Arch, and afterwards, hopefully, with provincial grand rank, and for the fortunate few, with grand rank and grand chapter rank. Promotions are a reflection of individual contribution to the craft and royal arch through an individual's lodge, chapter, and province. In the main, ranks are Masonic and honorary, unless you are fortunate to be given active rank, and even then the majority of active ranks are in practice Masonic and to a very large extent honorary. There are, however, several exceptions, and amongst the foremost of these in the craft are Grand Treasurers and Grand Superintendents of Works in provinces and at Grand Lodge. These appointments, when made as active offices, are, or at least should be, held by individuals who hold their rank in part for the professional experience which they have and the advice which they can give on financial and property matters respectively. There is only one provincial treasurer and Grand Superintendent of Works, and at Grand Lodge there is only one Grand Treasurer. When it comes to the Grand Superintendent of Works, Paul Abbott, who now holds the office, is supported by 2 deputies and 2 assistants. The Grand Superintendent of Works is normally appointed for 5 years, and those of you who are quick with your arithmetic will realise that in fact I served for 6. His deputies are appointed for 3 in one case and possibly longer in the other, and the assistants are appointed for 2 years. My professional background, as Andrew explained, was as a chartered surveyor and valuer. Paul Abbott, who's Grand Superintendent of Works now, is a chartered building surveyor. His senior deputy, Peter Vosser, has his own quantity and monitoring surveying consultancy, while Chris Huxtable, who is second deputy, is a practicing chartered surveyor working in asset management. Paul Turner is the senior of the 2 assistants. He also is a chartered surveyor with many years of experience in procurement and contract management, while the second assistant, Chris Clough, is also a chartered surveyor with over 30 years of experience in commercial property in the West Country. As you can see, there is a wide range of professional property skills and experience available to Grand Lodge on property matters. Collectively, Paul and his team are responsible to the board for the repair, refurbishment, alteration, and adaptation of Freemasons Hall. It is a major task in normal times, made even more challenging recently during the pandemic. Initially, in the early months of lockdown, all work had to stop, but as restrictions began to ease in the early summer last year, work at Freemasons Hall resumed, and it has continued ever since. Freemasons Hall, as many of you will probably know, was built between 1927 and 1933 as a memorial to the 3,225 Freemasons who were killed in the First World War. Called initially the Masonic Peace Memorial, it was renamed Freemasons Hall in 1939. The cost was £1 million, equivalent in terms of economic value today to £320 million. Although perhaps a better guide might be the valuation for insurance, which was completed relatively recently and which, by coincidence, put the current cost of rebuilding Freemasons Hall at the same figure, namely £320 million. A number of books and publications on Freemasonry contain a list of key dates over the years, including, for example, the date that the ancient moderns came together to form UGLE and the date that our present Grand Master was installed. One date is missing, and that is 1st of July 1947, an important date for any Grand Superintendent of Works. It was the day when the Town and Country Planning Act 1947 came into force. On the 9th of March 1982, Freemasons Hall became a Grade 2 star listed building for both its interior and exterior, and it, along with properties opposite, many of which are owned by Grand Lodge, is in the Seven Dials Constellation area. Several of the buildings on the north side of Great Queen Street are also individually listed. Once a building has been listed, the local planning authority and the conservation officer have control over virtually all internal and external work which is carried out. Methods of construction and the finishes required are frequently expensive. Planning officers have to work within national planning policy guidelines, and they are required to implement local plan policies. Conservation officers, on the other hand, have responsibility for protecting the heritage value of buildings of architectural and historic interest, which, by their nature, are individual. Conservation officers have wide-ranging powers, which frequently involve subjective judgments, which, even with professional advice, can be hard to predict. Carrying out work to a listed building, which requires but does not have listed building consent, is a criminal offence. And as I'm sure none of you would want an address from a past Grand Superintendent who works after 12 months in Ford Prison, we always treat the need for work in Freemasons Hall to be approved with the utmost care and respect. Late and unexpected interventions by the conservation officer can be a very real problem, as we discovered to our cost when we renewed the west door steps as part of work to form the VC Memorial in front of the West Tower in 2017. To deal with this, we are at an early stage in negotiation with the Conservation Officer and Historic England over a heritage partnership agreement, which will give approval in principle to specified works which we carry out frequently and repetitively. Examples range from future phases of repairs to the building's steel frame. You may have heard the term Regent Street disease. I'm happy to talk about that if you wish. Through work to repair and refurbish the many original toilets in the building, not very glamorous, but I'm afraid necessary, right down to the specification of the paint to be used when redecorating some of the more elaborately embellished lodge rooms, such as Lodge Room 10. HPAs are complex, they are time-consuming, and they are costly. But the prize is securing to Grand Lodge ownership and control of the timing and phasing of major works for repair, which we need to carry out. I've concentrated up to this point on repair, but that is without doubt the primary responsibility of the Grand Superintendent of the Works. But the more interesting challenge I had, and Paul Abbott now faces, is working to deliver changes to the way in which Freemasonry needs to use Freemasons Hall to support the vision of the craft's place in society today, which the Grand Secretary outlined at the quarterly communication of Grand Lodge back in December 2018. Freemasons Hall is, and it will remain, a Masonic building, but the craft's needs are changing. Some of you will know from personal experience that most of the lodge rooms in Freemasons Hall, with the notable exception of Lodge Room 10, were designed to accommodate meetings with an attendance of between 70 and 80. Prior to the pandemic lockdown, the average attendance was in the mid-20s. We cannot subdivide lodge rooms in response to this. Their scale and proportions were an important element within the original design of the building, and we know that any attempt to change this would meet with strong opposition from the conservation officer. We can, however, adapt space to form smaller lodge rooms from accommodation in the building designed for other uses. Examples of where this has been achieved in recent years was the conversion of 2 committee rooms on the Sussex corridor to provide 2 chapter rooms, and 3 lodge rooms created on the 3rd floor in what was originally 2 caretakers' flats. Whilst these changes take place, we are also looking at how the building can play its part in encouraging a wider understanding of Freemasonry in society. This means improving public access, both generally and through supporting outside higher events. Both encourage improved awareness while providing the opportunity for education through community engagement. Improving public access while at the same time meeting the continuing needs of UGLE, as well as those of Metropolitan Grand Lodge, the Library of Freemasonry, and the MCF, is far from straightforward. And we always have to keep in mind that our ideas and ambitions may not always meet with the approval of the conservation officer if the work we intend to carry out requires listed building consent. Some of the details may surprise you. Freemasons Hall, like many public buildings, fails to provide enough female toilets. The building was designed to provide toilets for the convenience of members, and the paid employees of Grand Lodge were thought most unlikely to include women. The world has changed, brethren. We have a legal obligation to provide facilities for both men and women who work in the building, and if we are serious in wanting to return after the pandemic as a venue available to host events such as Letters Live and London Fashion Week, we must provide facilities which are as good, if not better, than competing venues. The new unisex toilets located off the vestibule and those on the floor below contribute to meeting this need. Another example of a project which we believe will support both Masonic use of the building and community and outside hires was the project to install an emergency generator to secure uninterrupted electricity supply throughout the building despite power outages. One occurred about 6 years ago, and it was very embarrassing at the time. Having obtained both planning and listed building consent, an emergency generator located in one of the light wells was installed and became operational during the summer last year. I now turn to the process by which do we deliver these and other changes, what I would describe as the management and governance structure within UGLE. Back in 2006, when John Edgecombe was Grand Superintendent of Works, he personally chaired the committee which oversaw Grand Lodge's investment properties. However, work carried out within Freemasons Hall for which he was responsible was managed by no more than an informal arrangement involving regular liaison between himself as Grand Superintendent of Works and the then Director of Operations. It worked, but I think Roger Carter, who was at the time the Director of Operations, would be the first to agree that it was a system liable to outside influence from those with their own ideas of what should and should not be done. An important change to this informal approach came when Michael Baer, who preceded me as Grand Superintendent of Works, was able to sway the board that the more structured approach, which was working well in relation to the investment properties through the Property Investment Committee, could be equally useful in managing Freemasons Hall. Initially, this was organized through a House committee chaired by the Grand Secretary, which comprised the Grand Superintendent of Works, the Grand Treasurer, and the Director of Operations. This proved a very effective way of providing management control in relation to repair and maintenance, as well as new projects. And importantly, it avoided individual ideas getting into the system without oversight or scrutiny. This system continues today, but in a slightly different form. Grand Secretary's House Committee evolved into what is now the Hall Committee, which I chair, supported by Paul Abbott as Grand Superintendent of Works, with Masonic and policy matters in the hands of the Grand Secretary, and financial matters relying on the Grand Treasurer, Quentin Humberston. Technical input is provided by Mark Kennedy and Richard Jewett, who are respectively Head of Engineering and Head of Facilities. Paul Turner, who you may remember as one of the Assistant Grand Superintendents of Works, attends meetings of the committee. He brings valuable procurement and contract management experience to our discussions. So much rather for the organisation, what are we planning for the future? The first project I should mention, and which I touched on briefly earlier, is that of tackling Regent Street disease, which is dealing with the progressive deterioration in the structural steel frame of Freemasons Hall, where poor understanding in the mid-1920s of how to treat steelwork, which was being used to provide the principal structural frame of a building, has resulted over time in rust taking hold behind the brick and stone facades, affecting those parts of the building most exposed to wind and rain. Removing asbestos from Freemasons Hall, as many of you will remember, was a major challenge. Costly though that was, once the work had been completed, we were able to turn our minds elsewhere to other issues. Regent Street disease, however, is not going to be so easy. It will be a problem, or was a problem, not just for me. It will be a problem for Paul Abbott, and not only for him, but also his successor, and I suspect for those following both of us for many years to come. Phases 1 and 2 of this work were completed prior to the tercentenary, and we had intended to move to commence phase 3 during the summer of last year. That has now been put on hold as, along with the whole country, we review the financial impact and cost of the pandemic. A professional team to manage the project has, however, been appointed, and it remains on standby. This work, although necessary, when it does proceed, will not achieve changes to Freemasons Hall which will be immediate and obvious to you as Freemasons, or indeed to visiting members of the public. In a curious way, this is as it should be, bearing in mind that our responsibility is for the preservation of the building's architectural heritage. However, we must be aware of the importance of spending money responsibly in ways which improve facilities and, at the same time, whenever possible, also provide a financial return on the expenditure incurred. As an example of this was the project to refurbish and, in part, restore the former Lodge Room 1 and its anteroom to provide improved facilities for Masonic events and at the same time support opportunities for increased outside hire. Named the Gallery Suite, this project offered the potential for much greater than the occasional use which this part of the building gets at present. For the moment, this again is a project being held in abeyance, but I have no doubt that it will return. A talk about Freemasons Hall in early 2021 will be incomplete if I did not mention repair work recently completed to the mosaic ceiling in the Grand Temple. Investigative work into the cause of progressive cracking affecting the mosaic ceiling has been going on for many years. Indeed, it started even before my time. After a number of tests and taking advice from world-renowned experts, we established that the problem had its origin in damp penetration through a defective roof back in the 1990s. Happily, the nightmare of having to dismantle and rebuild the whole mosaic, which at one time seemed a very real possibility, passed, but repairs were extensive and they did require scaffolding. Paul Abbott, working with engineers, was able to design a suspended scaffold platform encased in protective sheeting, which was relatively unobtrusive and meant that the Grand Temple could still be available for use while repairs were carried out. Avid readers of the pages of Freemasonry Today from the Grand Secretary will, I hope, have spotted his reference to the relocation of Grand Lodge's general office from the ground floor behind Letchworth's shop to mezzanine space above the Sussex corridor, previously occupied by lodge rooms 18 and 19. This was a major project driven by the focus now being made at UGLE to encourage public interest in Freemasonry in the community. Using a publicly accessible part of the building as a general office, frankly, was a lost opportunity. After long and occasionally difficult discussions with the Conservation Officer, all necessary approvals were obtained. The internal dividing partitions forming the old lodge rooms 18 and 19 were removed last summer. Structural work followed, as did alteration and refurbishment. Both are now complete and literally, as I speak, fitting out is progressing to be followed by carpeting and furnishing, which will be finished in April. The existing general office on the ground floor was designed to be accessible, even if not always available, to members of the craft. That need is no longer pressing in an age when most communication with the administration at Grand Lodge is electronic, and this has allowed us to contemplate an alternative use for this space, which was once the general office. We are still planning the detail, but a members area with cafe and bar is one element of an exciting project, which will also include a shop window to Letchworth shop, which has now been relocated close to the library and museum on the first floor. Projects do not end there, but time is passing, and you must forgive me if I don't mention projects which are under discussion and being considered, but we have yet to report to the Board of General Purposes. I said in my introduction that I'd mentioned the work which we do at Grand Lodge to provide help and support to those not only in London but across the country who are responsible for the repair, maintenance and management of Masonic centres and halls, which of course are so important to our organisation. Masonic ownership of land and buildings extends well beyond Great Queen Street to the many Masonic halls and centres throughout the country. These, and this is important, are the responsibility of their owners. Whilst Freemasonry is a craft, running and managing these Masonic halls and centres is a business. Over the years, there have been many successes, but occasionally things have gone wrong, and the accompanying adverse publicity compromises years of hard work in promoting the reputation of Freemasonry for the better. We have within our membership valuable knowledge and experience of how to manage a Masonic hall and centre in a way which is both sustainable and financially viable. What we did not have until recently was a reference resource which brought together in one place experience and good practice. Back in 2015, Grand Lodge commissioned a report on the future of Freemasonry, and among its many conclusions was the fact that where we hold our meetings is not only important for our members, but also for those who join. The Improvement Delivery Group was set up under Sir David Wootton, and as part of its work, a membership focus group under Jeff Gillian, who was Provincial Grand Master of Yorkshire, North and East Riding, was set up, tasked, among other things, with creating a Masonic Halls Guidance Manual. The manual covers all areas of interest to those concerned with managing Masonic centres and halls, and it includes building maintenance, refurbishment, or perhaps the alternative of relocation, ownership structures and financial management, procurement, including utilities, insurance, and acquiring catering and other equipment, and increasing revenue streams. The scope of the guidance manual, as you can see, is far-reaching, and you'll be glad to know that I'm not going to look at it in detail this afternoon. I will simply pose 2 questions and leave you to ask me anything further if you wish. What is it for, and what is its status? The reason we have the guidance manual is to fill a gap in the sharing of knowledge and experience which exists within Freemasonry across the country concerning all aspects of the way we use and manage our buildings. Whatever the problem, you can be sure that someone, somewhere, has had to deal with it before, and yet lessons could never be learned. Experience was not shared other than by word of mouth, and when things have gone wrong, that is not always the most reliable way to make sure that we all understand how the mistakes occurred and how they can be avoided in future. We now have a single source for accessing help and guidance. Second question, what is its status? I referred earlier to help and guidance, and that is the central message. I always emphasize when talking about the guidance manual. In Freemasonry, we are all familiar with the obligation that we must comply with the Book of Constitutions. There is no parallel obligation to comply with guidance in relation to good practice, which is covered in the Hall's guidance manual. Masonic Hall's guidance group is not a subcommittee of the Board of General Purposes. We are, if you like, a Masonic quango. We do share drafts of guidance and advice, and in the last 12 months, we have issued a series of practice notes giving guidance and advice on matters of public and Masonic importance affecting our halls and centres and as a result of the pandemic. Clearly, we want to make sure that we have correctly understood UGLE's position, and who better to refer to for comment than the Grand Secretary, the Grand Treasurer, and the Head of Legal Services. But ultimately, responsibility for what is in the manual and contained within the practice notes rests with us. Finally, one word of caution. If any of you are members of a professional or other trade body, you will be familiar with the fact that good practice, if not best practice, is regarded as important to protect the reputation of its members and the services it provides, and importantly, the value of the qualifications it confers. Departing from good practice, once it is publicly available, will result in justified criticism if something goes wrong that could have been avoided had good practice in the guidance manual been followed. Thank you, President. You've been very patient, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to what I've been able to tell you this afternoon. If time is still on our side, Andrew, I'll be very, very happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Just a couple of things. I know there will be some hands up and questions coming on about kind of specific halls and things and your thoughts on different situations at the moment. But I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about Freemasons Hall. I was very lucky a number of years ago to go on a backstage tour, so to speak, of Freemasons Hall with the Connaught Club, which possibly didn't have the approbation of everybody at Freemasons Hall. Nevertheless, we did it anyway. And I was struck by the number of kind of, in gaming parlance, they'd be called Easter eggs, just these wonderful moments that you get in somewhere which you don't notice all the time, that you just go, that's really clever, or that's just amusing. I'm thinking of cases such as the new fire escapes from the Grand Temple and the bridges across that are shaped in the form of the square and compasses that unless you're looking at them and looking at them from the right angle, you wouldn't necessarily know. What's your favourite bit of Freemasons Hall, and why?
Oh, depends on the time of the year and the day and the week. There are so many fabulous areas in Freemasons Hall. Obviously, we are all familiar with the Grand Temple and the vestibule and the really big public spaces, and they are really impressive. The areas that I find fascinating are the more intimate spaces tucked away in the furthest corners of the building. And the reason I attach importance to them is that it illustrates the huge attention to detail which the original architects paid, not just to the Grand Temple, the processional corridor, and the really grand public areas, but also to the smaller individual lodge rooms, which all of us as Freemasons used to hold our lodge meetings. So, the barrel vaulted temple on the 3rd floor towards the back of the building, wonderful temple. So I suppose if I had to choose, I'd pick that, but all areas of the building are wonderful. You can get lost in it. Even I can suddenly find myself wondering where on earth I am. So it's a building that you could spend an age in. And before I finish, could I just say that if you, or indeed any group, would like to come down and have a tour around Freemasons Hall, when that is a privilege we're all allowed to share together sometime in the future, let me know. We'll be only too delighted to accompany you.
Phil Gooding.
Well, are you able to comment on the banqueting facility that's supposedly being built on the roof above Grand Temple?
Yes, if only to tell you that there's not much to tell you just at the moment. It is something which is being looked at. Obviously, the motivation for this is that from time to time, over the years, the Grand Connaught has not been altogether as we would like it. I'm trying to be diplomatic.
Going to be very tactful there.
There are many reasons. Some of you may remember a few years ago, the young lady who used to look after the organisation, and I'm personally not a great lover of a sweet after a meal. I always have cheese. And I used to pull her leg and say it was the mouse challenge. And it was basically, did I get my cheese before the Grand Master retired and we all left? And I should think it was about 50% of the time that I did, and the other 50% of the time I didn't. Anyway, sorry, that has nothing to do with the question you asked. We have a huge area on the top of Freemasons Hall, and it's in many ways over-engineered in terms of the structure, so that physically it could accommodate additional space at the top, on the roof. There are many, many challenges. The first and most significant, of course, is that we are a Grade 2 star listed building in a conservation area. But that is not possibly insurmountable. You can look around London at Somerset House, the various very prominent public buildings, and with careful architecture and clever design, you can in fact alter and adapt them. The real difficulty from our point of view is the cost. Quite frankly, it is extremely expensive. And I alluded in the talk to the fact that when we look at these projects, we are really concerned with two elements. Firstly, a financial return. And that's not the end of the story, because if there's a Masonic return, then that will also always feature in the board's decision on whether or not a project can proceed. But the numbers which preliminary estimates have provided to us for this project are pretty significant. And the result of the pandemic is obviously push it back for some considerable time.
Can I just, I'm aware that not everybody in the chat will have been to Freemasons Hall, and many that do won't necessarily appreciate the scale of the estate. Could you kind of cover how much of Great Queen Street it would be fall under your remit, so to speak?
Yes, we obviously own the freehold of Freemasons Hall. We also own the freehold of the Grand Connaught Rooms and the Sway nightclub. And on the opposite side of the road, together with the MCF, we own virtually all of those shop buildings with upper parts, offices and residential, ranged all the way up to the pub at the end, where we own half the pub. So the property portfolio is pretty extensive. In fact, we've only just completed the review of the value of the portfolio, which falls due on 31st December each year. Bit of a challenge this year, and we have had huge difficulties, like any other landlord, with tenants struggling to pay rents during lockdown. But we are gradually finding our way through, and yeah, hopefully we will be starting to rebuild the portfolio going forward.
Talking about rebuilding portfolios, I'd just like to turn attention to, there's a couple of hands up actually, I'll come to those in a second, Christopher and Ian. Just in turn, I mean, obviously we have the pandemic at the moment and emerging from that. if you were advising the kind of average Masonic hall as to what the best thing that they could do to improve their business practice or resilience over the next couple of years, what would be the first thing that you would ask them to do?
I think the first thing that I would ask them to do is to outline to me what their current business model is. Because the one thing we discovered very quickly with the Masonic Halls Advisory Group is that there is no single answer which will provide the best way forward in all circumstances. We have, frankly, have successful models which range from a Masonic hall which is operating financially in a viable way and confining itself exclusively to revenue which it generates from Masonic meetings. That, I would have to say, is probably more the exception than the rule. At the other end, you have large Masonic halls, which by reason of their location, their car parking, or their design, are well placed to allow external income through outside hires for weddings, for seminars, for office parties and whatever. And that works for them. I'm very closely involved in the Surbiton Masonic Centre. Some of you may have been there. Now, that is an example of a centre which frankly could not have survived had it not taken the commercial decision about 20, 25 years ago that with declining membership, it needed to introduce outside income, or frankly, it would have become unaffordable to Freemasons. They've been very successful, but a lot of that was to do with the design of the building, which enabled us to separate out entirely the hospitality side of the business, so that quite literally we can hold 3 or 4 Masonic units meeting and dining at the same time as hosting a wedding. And now, that's not available to everybody. So I go back to my first point, which is that there's no single answer, but the questions that need to be asked are probably the same in all cases. And they start with, what is your business model? What is your revenue? What are your costs? And crucially, have you given any thought to the numbers who are attending your Masonic Central Hall at the moment, and the likely change in that numbers over the next 5 to 10 years? Because in the same way that a lodge or chapter which is running into difficulties really needs to face up to that problem before it really hits the buffers, it is no different with a Masonic Hall or Centre. You need to have a plan for the future, either that is one that you're going to survive and thrive, or that you've got to look carefully at what your future may be.
I'll go to Christopher Maloney, then I'll go to Ian Edge. Christopher.
Oh, hi, John.
Hello.
I'm the current and acting superintendent of works for the province, and as such, I chair our hall support group. And I'm fascinated in what you've been saying so far in terms of what the Halls Advisory Group are doing and the Masonic Halls Guidance Manual. And I just wondered whether there was any consideration being given at UGLE with regarding to sharing good practice and further developing the links between UGLE and the provinces and between provinces on sharing that good practice in terms of helping, supporting and advising our Masonic halls.
A question which, if I may say, is music to my ears. The answer is yes. We've been very conscious that the Hall's manual in its current form contains an absolute wealth of information, but it's rather bulky, and furthermore, it's not terribly accessible. You have to go through BUGLE to get to it. And we are embarking now in consultation with people from around the country on a complete review, both of the content of the manual and also how it's accessed. And as part of that, who we are actually aiming for as our audience. Now, I need to just, I suppose, pause, particularly as we've got an assistant provincial secretary with us, and say that we are always very conscious that halls and centres are independent. They have their own boards of directors, their own boards of trustees. Province has an interest, but not a direct oversight. It can't dictate to its halls and centres. So we have to both keep provinces advised over what we are saying, whilst at the same time trying to engage directly with the people who we want to reach, who in fact would benefit from the advice that we're giving. Now that's a discussion which is ongoing, I am hopeful that if we get what we would like out of this review process, you will find it much, much easier to access directly the Hall's guidance manual. I'm personally a firm believer that keeping information confined and contained to groups, however senior within Freemasonry, if it's essential from a Masonic perspective, that's one thing. But I personally cannot see that there is any element about how you manage a Masonic Hall of the Centre which ought to be confined to any particular group within Freemasonry. So that's a long answer to your question, but it's work in progress. I'm very happy to share with you how you can get hold of me and Peter Foster, because we're the two people who are looking after this. And we are, I hope, going to be able to persuade everybody that there will be a consultation direct with provinces where we can get feedback over what you find works and what doesn't work in the manual as it is presently structured. And if there's a way we can improve it, I would like to hear.
Thank you, John. I'd like that information from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ian Edge.
Hello there. Can I ask that in the past, Mason's Hall was used for productions, and I was just wondering if that proved a significant revenue for the Hall, and was there any plan to do any future film productions?
That was a question about filming. And
sorry, Andrew. Thank you. The sound didn't come across.
Yeah.
Filming. One of the things about Freemasons Hall is that it is certainly one of the finest Art Deco buildings in the country, and is almost unique in the fact that it is still used for its original use. And there's been very little adaptation and alteration, and that makes it particularly suitable as a film set. Now, there's a balance, frankly, to be struck here. I said in the talk that Freemasons Hall is for Freemasons and for Freemasonry, and that must be its primary function. You, under no circumstances, could suddenly find that you can't hold a quarterly communication because they want to shoot a scene in the new James Bond film. So we do have to manage it, but using Freemasons Hall as for film purposes is a huge source of revenue. And frankly, all of us are interested in making sure that that building pays its way. One thing I didn't cover in my talk, and I do occasionally refer to when I'm talking to people, is the importance of the property investment portfolio as a generator of income to help the running costs of Freemasons Hall. Now, this is not the time to go into that because, as I said, the pandemic has caused huge problems for us as any other landlord. But in normal times, and if I had been giving this talk to you 18 months ago, I would have been able to tell you that the income from that portfolio is over £2 million a year. Very substantial sum of money, all of which is available to allow Freemasons Hall to be repaired and looked after without dipping into members' subscriptions. It's a bit of a sore point. You're up in Lancashire. How many of you come down to London? How many of you make use of Freemasons Hall? Now, if your subscriptions are contributing significantly to the running of Freemasons Hall, at the very least, I can imagine that is a talking point. So the property investment portfolio contributes hugely under normal circumstances to repair costs and revenue from outside filming also. Again, it's useful to open up the building to outside people because Freemasonry for far too long has been perceived, rightly or wrongly, as being this secret society beloved of those who look at Morse and films like that. They're forever taking side swipes at Freemasonry and the Masonic lodges. It is a problem. Now we're addressing it with David Staples and a new communication strategy. And as part of that, we want more people to come into Freemasons Hall, indeed to all Masonic buildings, so they realize that behind those closed doors, there is absolutely nothing sinister going on.
I think probably London Fashion Week is one of the clearest examples of that, isn't it?
Yeah. And of course, London Fashion Week highlights the importance, back to the mundane business of female toilets, because, we are a competing venue and there's no way that you can offer yourself as a venue for London Fashion Week if you've got all these people scantily clad wandering around endless parts of the building trying to find a toilet. It doesn't work.
And that's just at quarterly communications.
Just
there's a question in the chat from Kevin Poynton just about what you feel needs to be adopted going forward in terms of COVID security, that kind of thing.
The one thing that you will have been aware of is that Grand Lodge, absolutely rightly, has said that at all times it is going to be scrupulous in following government guidance in relation to lockdowns, COVID security, and so forth. It's a very individual thing. Each building will pose its own problems to COVID security in terms of separating people, separating groups, making sure that people entering the building do not conflict with people leaving the building. I can't give a very detailed answer other than to say that I, and I know some of your listeners here this afternoon, are very closely aware of the importance of making sure that we do provide absolute COVID security. This will become crucially important as we get out of lockdown. At the moment, who knows when that's going to happen. But Freemasonry is going to emerge from the pandemic over time with care, and I have a suspicion, and this is very much a personal view, that we are all going to find it rather more of a challenge than we expect. It was easy to get into lockdown. It happened overnight. All of a sudden, we were told no more Masonic meetings. We've all become used to being very cautious about coming into close contact with people over the last nearly 12 months, and we are not going to find it that easy to lose that instinct and caution. So it's going to be a process. And part of that, importantly, is giving people assurance that our buildings are genuinely COVID secure.
What do you feel? Sorry, I'm just checking. I'm not echoing anymore, I don't think. Just, yeah, the thumbs up from people. That's fine. Sorry, I was rather echoey on the previous question, apparently. Do you think there's anything that should be mandatory going into from one of the suggestions is, you know, sanitizing stations at the entrance to venues, dining rooms and lodge rooms, for example?
Well, if government regulations make it mandatory, absolutely, UGLE should make it mandatory. But I go back to a point I made earlier, which is that the responsibility for COVID security of buildings rests with the building's owners and managers. And it would be very unwise of us in the Halls Group or UGLE to dictate that in all circumstances, regardless of the individual situation, that something should or shouldn't happen. I mean, it's fairly common sense, isn't it, that COVID security is going to require people to sanitize as they enter a building, sanitize at regular intervals. You've seen the guidance on how we can manage our ceremonies in a way which is COVID secure. So it's an evolving situation. And I think all that I can responsibly say in answer to your question is that we will all collectively get into the detail of how we make our buildings and the way we use them and the way we meet COVID secure in the light of government regulations and, let's be honest, medical guidance, you know, when the time comes.
I suppose it goes beyond COVID security and essentially what is good for COVID security. I'm just kind of trying to summarize the points. What is good for COVID security is actually good for general good health in terms of colds and flu and that kind of thing. You know, it works not just for COVID, but for other kinds of infections as well.
It does, but the unique thing about COVID, of course, is, I mean, we've all been used over the years to the annual flu jab for those who took it, but the penalty for not taking it was that you'd catch flu. You might feel particularly unwell, but it wasn't necessarily life-threatening. Now, COVID-19, of course, has raised everybody's perception of a COVID virus infection to a wholly different level. And the frightening part about it was the ease of transmission, and in the early days, the very high risk of mortality, of dying from it. So it's a totally new situation in that sense. Time will tell, frankly. The government would like us to believe that vaccination over the next 6 to 9 months, perhaps followed with annual jabs every year to deal with variants, will eventually enable us to get back to some sort of normality. At the moment, I think, the jury is out on that. But it wouldn't surprise me if that doesn't eventually happen, and we all look back at the nightmare of living through 2020-21. But that's a long way away. And I think the only sensible thing to do is to take it all, frankly, a step at a time. Because I'll go back to my point. I think we are all going to find it quite difficult to readjust when eventually lockdown is eased.
John, it's been absolutely great to talk to you and great to hear some of the backstage things and the planning about Freemasons Hall and the work of the Hall's advisory group. I know I'm certainly looking forward to going and seeing the new shop and question mark whether the new cafe and social space downstairs in the old office will be. I'm looking forward to that as well if and when that happens.
I think it is going to happen. It was approved by the board last week. So,
oh, right. Well, they are. Is that hot off the press in that?
Indeed.
So, just a final question, which is quite pertinent, I think. What are you most looking forward to when we can meet again?
When we can meet again? Oh, frankly, literally just meeting again, because the one thing which I think personally I found, aside from being cut off from my family, apart from my wife, is that what I miss most is the companionship of Freemasonry. The companionship in the lodge, and I don't know about you, brethren, but how many times have I looked at this over the last 12 months? Not that many. And we're all going to be a little bit rusty. So that's going to be the first challenge. But the second, and let's be honest, enjoyable part of it will be enjoying the companionship of the festive boards, which personally I have missed hugely, both in private lodges, at Grand Lodge, and just generally in traveling around the country and meeting so many lovely people.
John, thank you very much. I'm going to hang around now and take some questions. No doubt there'll be some questions regarding the new temporary measures which came out on Monday. I dare say there'll be a couple of questions regarding that. Just a reminder about next week's. We have Sean Eyre from the George Washington Masonic National Monument joining us from Virginia, from Alexandria, Virginia, giving us a virtual tour of the monument and also talking about George Washington and his life as a founding father and a Freemason as well. So that's next week at 3 o'clock. That will also be broadcast live on YouTube as well via the provincial YouTube channel. We have opened this up to other provinces as well, to Cumberland and Westmoreland, East Lancashire and Cheshire as well. So if you find that you can't log on to the Zoom meeting and it's saying it's full, hop over to the provincial YouTube channel where you'll be able to watch. You can comment and join in just as you would on this with the chat, etc. So you'll be able to watch it on YouTube, live on YouTube as well as we go along. So that's coming up next week. As I say, I'm going to hang around and answer some questions if there are any. But once again, thank you, John. And brethren, I shall see you next week.